consideration of one gender in a particular field of study. So this means that in that field of study, in that field of education, there is over or underrepresentation of one gender. For example, we usually have high concentration of women in social sciences and humanities, but on the other hand, we have a high concentration of men in STEM. So I would like to ask you, why do you think that is? Why women select particular fields of study and men some others? Obviously, there are those areas that we have an equal representation of men and women. So for those that we don't have an equal representation, what do you think the main reasons are? If you could unmute your microphones or just quickly type something in the chat. Any ideas?
Maybe I could break the ice.
Sure, Angela, go ahead.
Yeah. Perhaps it's the kind of embedded in the overall culture of the particular society or societies in terms of the both the notion that STEM fields are more for men and the SSH are more for women because of the gender stereotypes that are still present even in the even if we speak that they are not that much present. So I think that could be simply the presence of the social stereotypes that are kind of well, part of the patriarchal culture in many societies still.
Great, Angela. Thank you very much. Indeed, there are stereotypical gender roles which lead men and women towards particular directions in terms of studying, as well as cultural norms, as you mentioned. So we have associated particular professions with a particular gender. For example, we expect nurses to be women, and we expect, for example, pilots to be men. So I would like to ask whether your field of study is male or female dominated, or there's an equal representation. Most of you have a background in sports, so you can refer to the particular sport or the faculty overall. Again, some of you already mentioned this during the plenary discussion we just had. So if any of you would like to mention the particular sport and whether it's male or female dominated, or other colleagues, whether their field of study is male or female dominated. So if you want to, you can use your mics or you can quickly type in the chat. So for example, let's say tennis, I don't know, balanced. Okay, so I think there are some answers. So sociology, it's male dominated. Dance, balanced. Sociology, more female dominated. Karate, more or less equal representation. Figure skating, female dominated. Basketball, mostly dominated by men. Rowing, balanced. Okay. Some of you did not write the particular field. table tennis balanced, teachers mostly female, karate almost balanced, dancing female dominated, biochemistry male dominated, and gymnastics female dominated. Okay, so we can see that there are some particular fields of study which are balanced, but in many cases we see that some sports are more female or male dominated. So thank you very much for your responses. So now that we have explored horizontal segregation, let's move to vertical segregation, which has to do with gender differences in enrollment and graduation from tertiary education. So this does not have to do with whether more women select a particular field of education or a particular discipline or men, but whether we have more men or women studying overall. The case is that we have more women than men enrolled in higher education, at least in the European Union, and we have an almost equal number of women and men PhD students, which is a very positive development that has happened in the recent years. On the other hand, however, higher positions in academia are usually held by men. Again, this is something you mentioned during the discussion, and women also tend to be underrepresented in research. Let's have a look at some specific numbers from the European Commission. For example, for the year 2018, this is the She Figures report for 2021. So, for example, in 2018, around 32% of researchers were women. Also, only 26.8% of grade A academic positions in 2018 were held by women. By grade A, we mean full professorship or equivalent. Similarly, the proportion of women heading higher education institutions was significantly small, only 23.6% in 2019, and only 31% of members of scientific boards in 2019 were women. During the period from 2015 to 2019, only 1.8% of publications addressed a sex or gender dimension of a topic, which is very, very small. From 2013 to 2017, there were twice as many men than women among authors of scientific publications. And within the same period, only 20% of international patent applications included a woman, and around half of the inventors' teams consisted only of men. So we can see some examples of vertical segregation in academia and research in the European Union. So another important issue that we need to be aware of is gender bias. Bias in general can have two forms. It could be explicit, thus conscious and intentional. So we have an intentional positive or negative attitude towards a particular group of people, or in this case, a particular gender, for example, towards women or towards men. So in this presentation, because I have used a lot of data from the European Union and from academic studies, from journal articles, we can see this distinction between men and women. But as is going to be mentioned later on, obviously gender intersects with other aspects. For example, sexual orientation. We're going to talk about age, ethnicity, and other factors. Implicit bias, on the other hand, is unconscious. So we make decisions or we make judgments for particular people, particular entities, without realizing that we're doing so. Of course, this is due to stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So we might be particularly biased towards a particular gender or towards a particular group of people without or with actually the intention of doing so. So what do we mean by gender bias in academia and research? First of all, this has to do with the fact that the gender dimension is often ignored in teaching and research. So it's not discussed, it's not taken into consideration as a factor, and it's not being part of our curricula and syllabi. This leads to lack of diversity and inclusion. Research can also be gender blind, so not taking into consideration the gender factor at all, or gender bias. So, for example, bias towards a particular gender, not taking into consideration the opinions or ideas or experiences of a particular group. This means that the result is products, services, or policies that are targeted at or they serve only a particular part of society, and the other part of society or the other parts are ignored and overlooked. This can also have a significant impact on scientific productivity. This has been mentioned in many studies in STEM, authorship, since we have more male authors than women authors, as well as peer-reviewed processes, which can be gender biased. Three very important concepts that we need to be aware of, three metaphors, are those of glass ceiling, glass cliff, and sticky floors. I'm sure you've heard of glass ceiling, which refers to those invisible barriers that hinder women's advancement to the highest positions of organizations, for example, the university. Some of you already referred to this, that there are some unseen barriers. Sometimes women make it to top positions, but in many cases they're appointed in positions which are risky or problematic. So we call this the phenomenon of the glass cliff. And in many cases, women cannot move up the ladder, so they cluster, as Clavero and Gallagher put it, in precarious forms of employment at the bottom of the academic hierarchy. But what do we mean by precarious form of employment? Let's have a look at the term and the definition. So precarious work is defined as low quality employment. This could have to do with low payment or low productivity, or simply a dead-end job. It can also have to do with the nature and of the contract. For example, it could be temporary, seasonal, short part-time, on-call work, day hire, or a very short-term contract. And we need to see this as a continuum. So there might be low precariousness employment and high precarious employment. And of course, this depends on the wage and on the legal protection that the different forms of employment have in different communities. Outside academia, it's usually people of low levels of education that are more likely to do a precarious job. And finally, I would like to refer to mobility in academia and research. So we all know that there is a lot of international mobility in higher education, but again, there are some gender inequalities. For example, the literature mentions that women academics experience much less mobility than men, and that they are more likely to quit their jobs to join their partners. What do you think? Why do you think this is? Why is it that it's usually male academics that are more mobile than women? Any ideas? Why do you think it's mostly women who are expected, let's say, to quit the job and join their partners abroad?
There are some responses in the chat.
Sorry, I'm not seeing those. Okay.
Should I read them out?
No, it's okay. I just opened it, Ildi. Thank you very much for this. So house duties, more obligations with family and kids. Men are paid more. Problems with top managers, care duties, family reasons, childcare. So childcare, family obligations seems to be a very important reason indeed. Okay, that's one of them. And also some of you mentioned payment. Okay, great. Thank you so much for your responses. So it has to do with those gender stereotypes that we talked about before. So women are expected to be the caregiver. So they're expected to take responsibility of their family. take care of the children. And in the case of women who do not have any children, they are expected to take care in some societies, for example, older relatives or other relatives, while men are seen as the breadwinners. So they're supposed to get out there and bring back the bread to the family table. Also, women are expected to take more responsibility of the well-being of the relationship. So that means that they're supposed to make more sacrifices, thus quitting their jobs. And lastly, it has to do with the fact that women tend to have a smaller network of collaborators in academia, thus less chances, less opportunities, fewer opportunities for international mobility. And as we said before, there are other factors that come at play. For example, age. Participants of a younger age are more likely to quit the job and join their partners. As we said before, partnership, children, socioeconomic background, academic integration, the level at which they work. So all those factors affect international mobility. So why is the promotion of gender equality so important? It is very important because it could have a positive impact on various aspects. First of all, complying with domestic or EU regulations, but more importantly, it could have a significant impact on the well-being of employees. Also, it can foster and enhance the social dialogue and the cooperation between stakeholders. It can facilitate and improve internal decision-making processes and career management procedures. And more importantly, it can enhance this sense of inclusiveness and the sense of communities within academic institutions. Finally, it can significantly improve the quality of research and teaching, not only because people will have equal opportunities, but also because it will consider gender, the gender dimension in those areas. And finally, it can significantly improve the overall profile of the organization. So gender inequalities can affect many people in academia and research, ranging from academic staff to administrative staff, the students, the families, the local as well as the wider society in those areas. Thus, it's not a marginal issue, but it's a crucial matter that concerns all members of an organization. And it can have significant mental, physical, financial, social, as well as other consequences for people who work at those organizations or are affected by those organizations. So promoting gender equality is crucial, and one way to do so is through gender equality plans. That's all from me. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Zoe. I will talk a bit about the specific issue of gender-based violence, seeing as we have that as our focus in our project. Can you see my screen properly?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that okay?
No, it's in the presenter view, and we see your next slide and quick to add notes.
Yeah, you have to swap displays, I think.
But is it still
Stop your screen, no?
There we go. Thank you. So gender-based violence, specifically then as a form of gender inequality, what is at stake? We've known about the harmful impacts of gender-based violence in academia and research for more than 50 years, but still it persists as a very prevalent problem. And in some instances, it's become a near normalized part of academic cultures. It reduces the well-being of staff and students. It reduces their participation and performance, and it has a direct negative consequence or impact on both the quantity and the quality of research. And gender-based violence drives students and staff out of academia. It is defined by the European Commission as, and this is a quote, violence directed against a person because of their gender and includes acts resulting in or are likely to result in physical, sexual, psychological, or economic harm or suffering, including threats of such acts, coercion, and control. And it's important to, even though we split the different forms of violence quite often, it's important to remember that they are interrelated and they exist on a continuum. And that they're interrelated means that in organizations where there's a high prevalence of, for example, sexual harassment, there's also likely to be a high prevalence of gender harassment, economic violence, physical violence, or psychological violence. So how common is gender-based violence in universities and academia? So the UNICEF survey from 2022, which is the largest cross-cultural survey on this topic in the European research area and includes 42,000 respondents in 15 countries, shows that 2 in 3 in academia have suffered some form of gender-based violence during work or study. So across students and staff, among 42,000 respondents, nearly 2 in 3 has been a victim of gender-based violence. "57% report that they've been subjected to psychological violence, 31% that they've been subjected to sexual harassment, and 10% economic violence." And you can see the other numbers on the slide. So these numbers make universities and research organizations the most dangerous place to be in terms of gender-based violence. But these experiences are not... Sorry, is my slide changing on your screen? It is not changing on my screen.
We are seeing now the prevalence of gender-based violence.
Yeah, so when I'm trying to change slides here, that doesn't work.
It's moving the arrows, I think.
Thank you.
Now it's changing.
There we go. So gender-based violence is not equal. It doesn't affect different gender groups equally. So women are more likely than men to be subjected to gender-based violence, and non-binary people or other gender identities are more likely than both women and men to be subjected to some form of gender-based violence. And this holds true across all forms except for physical violence, where men are more likely than women to be subjected to violence, but still non-binary people are at the highest risk. The consequences of gender-based violence are severe and many. So among staff who have experienced some form of gender-based violence, that's the dark purple on the slide, are more likely to suffer work-related consequences. So in particular, they are more likely to be dissatisfied with their jobs, to experience reduced work productivity, or to consider leaving the academic sector altogether. And this is for staff. The same pattern applies for students. Students who have experienced gender-based violence are more likely than those who haven't experienced gender-based violence to miss classes, feel dissatisfied with their courses or studies, to experience reduced learning achievements. They are more likely to have changed or tried to change their institution, their lecturer, or their supervisor. And they are more likely to have decided to not pursue further studies or considered to opt out of university studies altogether. If we look at the confidence in institutions, which is very serious from the perspective of the institutions and for the legitimacy of academia as a whole, we see that both staff and students who experience gender-based violence at work or at their study place lose the confidence in the institution's ability to deal with gender-based violence. 55%, if you look at the 24 and the 40 there, there's a decimal, that's why the numbers don't add up. And never mind, if you look at it as a whole, 55% of them are not confident or not very confident that that the institution can deal with gender-based violence at all, or that they can address these issues. And if you look at taking actions and protecting victims, on the whole, the majority of the respondents in the UNICEF survey, they agree or strongly agree that the institutions would offer protection or provide services to someone who made a formal complaint of gender-based violence. But this is significantly lower for those respondents who experience gender-based violence. So those respondents are less likely to agree that the institution would believe the person who made a formal complaint. They're less likely to believe that the institution would support them after they made a formal complaint. and they are less likely to believe that the institutions would take steps or actions to protect them or to take any measures after they've reported the incidents. So to conclude, let me just turn this one off. Academic institutions have a lot of work to do to reduce the prevalence of gender-based violence, and doing so requires that we design and we implement effective policies and policy measures that include prevention, protection, prosecution, partnerships, and the provision of services. So gender-based violence is, as you've seen, not only a matter of individual harm or suffering, or individual people's health and well-being, it's also a question where the entire legitimacy and the stake of academia as a democratic institution can be questioned. And this is where we need to be extremely good at designing and implementing our 4 IGEPs with a focus on gender-based violence. So I'm looking forward to a lot of work with you on this. So you've heard a lot of concepts and data and information about gender equality and gender-based violence in higher education. So we would like to move on to looking a bit closer at what these concepts mean for the next few minutes. And then we'll wrap up for the next session. Can I hand over to you, Karin?
Yes, that's fine. I will just share my screen. See if I can get it on full screen. Okay, so do you now see it in full screen, or do you have the shared screen?
Your screen.
You have, okay, let's see. So,
seeing the full screen, Karin.
you see the full screen? Okay, oh, sorry.
No,
Sorry,
no, we didn't.
You didn't.
No.
I don't know why it does like that, because it should.
No, it's working. No, it's okay.
It's okay now. Okay. Yes, please let me know if something.
Maybe you could reduce the notes so that we see more.
Yeah, no, that's what you shouldn't see the notes.
And we will still
But
see
it doesn't. Okay.
Maybe
I can do it.
I think that's
Is
fine.
it okay like that?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can see.
Okay. Okay. So I'm Karin Grahn, and I will present on some key concepts of the supporter project. I hope that my screen changed now. So I will talk a little bit of why it is important to have a mutual understanding on key concepts that we use in this project. And the concepts that I will talk about is gender, gender plus, intersectionality, gender equality, and gender-based violence. However, since Sofia has already talked about gender-based violence, I will not spend so much time on this concept. And in the presentation, I will go through the meaning of these concepts, and I will also exemplify them within a sport context. And I thought this would be a good way to kind of see how you can use the concepts since we are from from sport departments. So why is it important to have a mutual understanding in the project? Well, it's important for us to use the same vocabulary and understand and describe this concept in a mutual way. For some of you, these concepts that I'm presenting today may be a repetition of what you already know, and for some of the concepts might be not so familiar concepts. But the point of going through these concepts is to, for us in the supported project, to start from common grounds. And it's important to get unified on these theoretical concepts underpinning the supported project, so that we can also see how the concepts relate to each other. So I will start on gender. Gender is conceptualized as a social construct, and easily put, you can say that gender can be explained as the social and cultural construction of sex. As such, we kind of fill the categories of man and woman with content such as how you're supposed to look, how you're supposed to talk, or what kind of sports you're supposed to do. And in other words, this can be explained as masculinities and femininities. That is, ideas about women and men and how they are, their bodies and appearance, and also power relations between women and men. Gender as a concept can be understood as both a hierarchy, a relation, and a process. And this is rather than looking at gender as biology, or as we usually do in research, as a variable. Gender as a social construct draws on feminist and intersectionality theories, and this is also the theories that we draw on in the supported project. And of course, gender has an effect both on micro and meso and macro levels, as well as their relationship to each other. And within this conceptualization, we try to go beyond an understanding of gender as a binary. So why is this important, to go beyond an understanding of gender as a binary? This is because a binary understanding departs from an organizational principle of division, which divides mankind into two subgroups, women and men. For example, by the division of labor or the organization of sports. And the horizon segregation, which Zoe talked about, also leads to vertical segregation, which also we talked about in academia, but also in sports, of course. This is also based on a hierarchy of division of power. For example, the division of labor are tied to a division of earnings, with men generally earning more than women, or as exemplified in sports, male athletes gaining more resources, earning more money, and getting more publicity. And we also know that in sports, it's common for male to have more powers, for example, being on leading positions and so on. So the organizational principle of division are also consciously shaping differences, which again shapes larger hierarchies between men and women, and also further genders. So this also shapes an uneven power relations. And going beyond binary understanding instead includes the experiences of women, men, and further genders. So that is what we want to kind of, how we want to look at gender, not as a divided binary, but instead as different experiences that we can see from both men, women, and further genders. I will just get do an example also for gender in sports. So sport reflects, of course, and reinforces norms from society at large. So, for example, we can see the logic of separation always being very vivid in sports too. So sport is also known for having a tendency to strengthen gender differences through the logic of separation. Women and men, boys and girls, are separated usually both in training and in competition. And this builds on the idea of sport being fair, and it wouldn't be fair for women and men to compete with each other. However, this separation is also done in sports where no strength or speed is really attached to the sport. For example, the logic of separation is used also in sports such as archery or shooting, and also in children's sports. And in sports, gender differences are reinforced. And as an example, adding different expectations on how to use the female or the male body. Such an example is shown in the pictures here with American football and cheerleading. You shape very different masculinities and femininities through different sports. And as so we talked about in academia, of course, there are a lot of stereotypes in gender, in sports and in academia, and sometimes if you combine them, for the sport departments, you might find stereotypes that we already have in the sport actually also going into the academia. Of course, okay, so continuing on to next concept, we also have gender plus, which is an important concept because we cannot understand gender just on itself. Gender is thereby understood as an always interconnected with other inequality grounds and access of power. So there is no like pure gender. We always have to see the combination with other inequality grounds, such as, for example, age, disability, ethnicity, race, social class, and so on. Gender is always in focus when we do research, when we do equality work and so on. Gender is in focus, but never unilaterally. And in the supporter project, gender is approached as always interconnected with other inequalities. And that is why we use the suffix gender plus. Also in the supporter project, we have chosen to focus more on some of the inequality grounds, which is age, disability, gender, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. Of course, all kinds of inequality grounds are of importance, but we have narrowed it down to at least have a little bit more focus on this. Also relating to gender plus is, of course, intersectionality. An intersectional approach considers how gender is always shaped by other inequality grounds and the overall effect of their intersections. So, for example, you are not just a woman affected by gender structures and norms. You're also a woman maybe with a certain organ and certain age, ability, disability, or sexual orientation, and so forth. And then structure and norms from these inequality grounds will also be interconnected. And therefore, the intersection of gender, age, ability, sexual orientation is of importance to understand both inequality, equality, and also towards working towards equality. An example of how intersections with gender affects sports is that people tend to perceive some sports as feminine and some sports as more masculine, and they are so called gender marked. And the combination of these understandings are often linked to sexuality. So when, for example, a man are engaging in a female coded sport, they like figure skating or gymnastics, for example, that lead run the risk of getting their heterosexuality questions. And likewise, of course, for women who get engaged in male-coded sports, like ice hockey, for example. And the understanding of gender as a binary in sports also complicates the situation, for example, intersex athletes or athletes who do not identify as either male or female. And without an intersectional approach, the sports athletes may be excluded from competition. And there are also a lot of examples from even children being excluded by not fitting into the binary organization of sports. So departing from this binary view of gender is again very important, and also in the intersectionality aspect. Also, we need to remember that athletes, or in the case of academia, employees and students, their gender always intersects with, for example, sociocultural background, ethnicity, age, and so forth. And all of this will shape their experience as a student or as an athlete or as an employee. So also we will talk about gender equality, but this will come more in the coming sessions that we have in the upcoming modules. I will not talk so much about this. I will just mention the concept. about equivalent conditions on all levels and in all contexts. That includes rights, possibilities, and obligations. And working towards inequality, working towards equality includes both structural and ideological changes. So to reach former goals, for example, an even distribution of gender on leading positions, we need to work both on the actual goal, but also norms and attitudes surrounding gender, including other inequality grounds. And last but not least, we have gender-based violence. And as Sofia has presented on this already, I will not go into the details on this, but we know this is a very important concept for us to keep in mind when we work in the supporter project, and also to think that this intersects with other inequality grounds. And we also use gender-based violence as an inequality of its own. So with that, I